I'm writing this for my granddaughter to read when she turns 18. I was sworn to secrecy decades ago about what I found in the Rocky Mountains, and I've kept that promise until now. But she deserves to know the truth about what happened in that valley, about what the authorities sealed off and erased from every map. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about the world. There's so much more out there than we're told, and I want her to understand that magic and mystery still exist, hidden in places most people will never see. It was the summer of 1987, and our small team of 4 had been hiking for 3 days to reach a remote valley deep in the Rockies. We were there to investigate reports of Native American cave paintings that a ranger had stumbled across the previous year. The location was so isolated that we could only get supplies dropped by helicopter every 2 weeks. No cell phones existed back then, and even our radio barely worked in that terrain. We were truly cut off from the rest of the world. The valley itself was breathtaking, the towering pine trees, crystal clear streams, and mountains rising on all sides like natural fortress walls. The air smelled clean and sharp, filled with the scent of pine needles and wildflowers. We set up base camp near a small creek and spent the first few days mapping the area and searching for the cave entrance the ranger had mentioned. He'd given us rough coordinates, but finding anything in that wilderness was like searching for a needle in a haystack. On our 4th day there, we finally found it. The cave entrance was partially hidden by a rockfall that looked recent, maybe from the previous winter. We cleared away enough debris to squeeze through, and what we found inside took my breath away. The walls were covered in paintings unlike anything I'd seen in 20 years of archaeological work. Most Native American rock art depicts animals, hunters, and geometric patterns. These paintings showed something different. Massive humanoid figures standing alongside normal-sized humans. The proportions were deliberate and consistent across multiple panels. These weren't stylized or symbolic. They looked like documentary paintings of actual events. As we moved deeper into the cave system, we discovered more evidence that challenged everything we knew. There were remains of structures, primitive shelters built from branches and mud, tool marks on the walls, and carved implements scattered on the ground. But the scale was all wrong. The tools were sized for hands at least twice as large as human hands. The sleeping platforms were enormous. Even the fire pit in the center of the main chamber was larger than necessary for normal human use. What really unsettled us was the evidence that someone or something had been using this cave recently. There were fire pits with ash that couldn't have been more than a few weeks old. Food remains, mostly plant matter, and what looked like the bones of small animals were piled in one corner. Strange woven mats made from grass and bark lay rolled up against the walls. Everything pointed to one impossible conclusion. Something very large and very intelligent was still living in this area. I've always been an early riser, so the next morning I grabbed my camera and binoculars and headed back to the cave alone. I wanted to photograph the paintings in the soft light of dawn before the others woke up. The walk took about 20 minutes from our camp, following a game trail through the forest. Birds were just starting to sing, and mist hung low in the valley. Everything felt peaceful and ordinary. I just finished setting up my camera on its tripod when I noticed movement across the valley, maybe half a mile away on the opposite slope. At first I thought it was a bear, but something about the way it moved didn't look right. I pulled out my binoculars and adjusted the focus, and what I saw made my hands start shaking so badly I almost dropped them. Standing there in a clearing at the forest edge was a creature unlike anything I'd ever imagined could exist. It stood upright like a human, but it had to be at least 8 or 9 feet tall. Maybe more. It was hard to judge at that distance. Its entire body was covered in thick, reddish-brown fur that caught the morning sunlight. The fur was longer around the shoulders and head, giving it an almost mane-like appearance. But what struck me most was how purposeful its movements were. This wasn't some confused animal wandering around. The Bigfoot moved through the forest with clear intent, stopping to examine certain plants, carefully selecting and gathering them into what looked like a crude basket woven from bark. I stood frozen behind a boulder for at least 20 minutes, watching through my binoculars as the Bigfoot foraged. It seemed completely unaware of my presence. At one point, it sat down on a large rock and appeared to sort through what it had gathered, setting aside some plants and keeping others. The behavior was so deliberate, so intelligent, that I felt like I was watching a person rather than an animal. When it finally stood up and disappeared back into the tree line, I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to move. I practically ran back to camp. My mind was racing with what I'd seen, but I knew how insane it would sound. My 3 colleagues were having breakfast around the campfire, and when I stumbled into camp breathing hard, they looked up with concern. I sat down and tried to calm myself before speaking. How do you tell people you've just seen a cryptid that everyone believes is a myth? But these were fellow scientists, and we were in an isolated valley where we'd already found evidence of something unusual. I took a deep breath and told them everything. The next morning, I convinced one of my colleagues to hike with me toward where I'd seen the Bigfoot. We told the other 2 we were going to survey the far side of the valley, which was technically true. We brought all our equipment, cameras, notebooks, binoculars, everything we might need to document what we found. The hike took us through some rough terrain, scrambling over fallen trees and pushing through thick underbrush. Several times I worried we'd gotten turned around, but I'd marked the location on my topographic map and we stayed on course. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached a ridge that overlooked a hidden valley within the larger valley. A natural bowl formation completely surrounded by steep cliffs on 3 sides. From our vantage point on the ridge, we had a perfect view down into this hidden area, and what we saw made us both gasp out loud. There, nestled in the trees at the base of the cliff, was a settlement. Not a random cluster of caves or shelters, but an organized village with at least 15 to 20 distinct structures. The structures were built from woven branches, mud, and stone, primitive in materials but sophisticated in construction. They were arranged in a rough circle around a central communal area with a large fire pit. As we watched through our binoculars, Bigfoots moved between the structures, going about what could only be described as daily life. Adults carried bundles of plants or firewood. Younger ones, clearly juveniles based on their smaller size, chased each other around the open areas in what looked like play. Elders sat in the shade near the entrances to certain structures, seemingly watching over everything. We could see evidence of organized community everywhere we looked. There were dedicated food storage areas built into the cliff face, protected from weather and animals. Tool-making stations where Bigfoot sat chipping away at stones to create implements. Pathways worn smooth by countless footsteps connecting the different structures. This wasn't a temporary camp or a random gathering of creatures. This was an established settlement that had clearly been here for a long time. I estimated the population at somewhere between 40 and 50 individuals, though it was hard to be certain as they moved in and out of structures and the forest. My colleague and I spent the entire day on that ridge, taking turns with the binoculars and documenting everything we saw. We took hundreds of photographs with our telephoto lenses. We sketched the layout of the village in our notebooks. We recorded detailed observations about the Bigfoot's behavior, their apparent social structure, how they interacted with each other. By late afternoon, we both knew we were faced with an impossible decision. This was the discovery of the century, proof that a species of intelligent hominid had survived in North America, completely unknown to modern science. But reporting it would bring the outside world crashing into this hidden valley, and we had no idea what consequences that might have for these creatures. As the sun began to set and we prepared to hike back to our camp, we talked about our options. Could we keep this secret? Should we? We had a responsibility to report our findings, but we also felt a strange, protective instinct toward these beings who'd managed to remain hidden for so long. In the end, the decision was made for us. We had 2 other team members who deserved to know what we'd found, and if we kept it secret, other hikers or researchers might stumble across the village anyway. At least if we reported it through proper channels, there might be some chance of protecting the area. That night, back at our base camp, we told the other 2 team members what we'd discovered. They thought we were joking at first, but when they saw our photographs and detailed notes, their skepticism turned to stunned disbelief. We spent hours debating what to do next. Finally, we decided to use our emergency radio to contact our base coordinator. The radio connection was terrible, full of static, but we managed to get across the essential information. We'd found something extraordinary. We needed guidance on how to proceed. We strongly recommended that whoever came out here treated the situation with extreme sensitivity. What happened next was both faster and more overwhelming than we'd anticipated. Within 36 hours, military helicopters appeared over the valley, not just 1 or 2, but a whole fleet. They landed in the meadow near our camp, and men in military uniforms poured out along with people in civilian clothes who identified themselves as federal officials. They were polite but firm. We were to pack up our equipment immediately. We were being evacuated. They asked us hundreds of questions about what we'd seen, where exactly the village was located, whether we'd had any direct contact with the creatures. We handed over all our photographs, notes, maps, everything we'd documented. Before we were allowed to board the helicopters, we each had to sign multiple non-disclosure agreements. The message was clear. What we'd found was now classified information. If we spoke to anyone about it, family, friends, other researchers, the media, we would face prosecution under national security laws. The threat of prison time was explicitly stated. They assured us this was for the protection of the creatures as much as anything else. If word got out, the area would be swarmed by hunters, thrill seekers, and cryptozoologists. The Bigfoot community would be destroyed. As the helicopter lifted off and carried us away from the valley, I looked down and could already see more helicopters arriving with equipment and personnel. Over the next week, while we were debriefed at various government facilities, we learned that a perimeter was being established around a 20-square-mile area encompassing the valley and the surrounding mountains. Guard posts were set up. Fences were erected in strategic locations. The official cover story released to the public was that unexploded ordnance from World War II training exercises had been discovered in the area, making it too dangerous for civilian access. The entire region was declared off-limits and was quietly removed from public maps and official park boundaries. To the outside world, that valley simply ceased to exist. 2 weeks after being evacuated, I received a phone call at my home from someone who identified himself only as a government liaison. He asked if I'd be willing to return to the site as a civilian consultant. My archaeological expertise and field observations made me valuable to their ongoing operations. The conditions were strict, continued military supervision at all times, all previous non-disclosure agreements remained in effect, absolutely no photography or independent documentation, and no contact with anyone outside the operation about where I was or what I was doing. I'd have to tell my family I was on an extended research expedition. I said yes immediately. How could I not? This was the opportunity of a lifetime, the chance to study an unknown species, to possibly communicate with them, to learn about their culture and way of life. Yes, I was troubled by the secrecy and the military presence, but I told myself that at least this way I could help ensure the Bigfoots were treated with respect rather than as security threats or research specimens. When I returned to the valley, I barely recognized it. What had been pristine wilderness was now a quasi-military research outpost. There were temporary buildings clustered near our old campsite, generators running day and night, communication equipment, vehicles. A perimeter fence had been erected around the entire inner valley where the Bigfoot village was located, with guard posts every few hundred yards. Most impressively, they'd built camouflaged observation stations on the ridges overlooking the village, equipped with one-way glass and sophisticated optical equipment. I was assigned quarters in one of the temporary buildings and given a full briefing on the operation's objectives. The primary goal was to observe and document the Bigfoot community while minimizing disturbance to their way of life. No direct contact was to be attempted unless absolutely necessary. The Bigfoots appeared unaware of our presence, and the authorities wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. My role would be to observe from the hidden stations and provide expert analysis on their behavior, social structures, and cultural practices. For the first several weeks, I spent nearly every waking hour in the observation stations watching the Bigfoot village through high-powered binoculars and telescopes. The stations were comfortable enough with chairs, heating, and all the equipment I needed, but staying still and quiet for hours on end was exhausting. Still, I was witnessing something no modern human had ever seen before, and the anthropologist in me was fascinated by every detail. The Bigfoots followed clear daily patterns. Each morning, as the sun rose over the eastern ridge, the entire community would gather in the central area around the main fire pit. This wasn't just a random assembly. It had all the hallmarks of a deliberate meeting. One of the elders, a massive silver-haired Bigfoot who clearly commanded respect, would stand before the group and make a series of vocalizations and gestures. The others would respond in kind, and then they'd disperse to begin the day's activities. The division of labor was sophisticated and well organized. Adult Bigfoots would leave the village in small groups to forage in different directions, each group apparently assigned to specific areas. Some headed toward the berry patches on the southern slope. Others went to the stream where certain edible plants grew abundantly. A few ventured into the deeper forest in search of roots and fungi. Meanwhile, juveniles remained in the village under the supervision of elders, practicing skills they'd need as adults. I watched young Bigfoots learning how to weave baskets, how to chip stone tools, how to identify useful plants. The learning was hands-on and patient, with elders demonstrating techniques and then letting the juveniles try for themselves. Their communication system was more complex than I'd initially realized. While they did vocalize as deep rumbles, sharp barks, and various hoots and grunts, most of their communication seemed to rely on gestures and body language. I started keeping detailed notes on what different signals appeared to mean. Low rumbles with a specific hand gesture seemed to be a greeting. Sharp barks accompanied by an upright, stiff posture appeared to be warnings. When Bigfoots approached each other with hunched shoulders and avoided eye contact, it looked like a sign of submission or respect. Open palms held up seemed to signal peaceful intentions. The more I observed, the more certain I became that this was a genuine culture, not just animal behavior. These beings had traditions that were passed down from elders to juveniles. They had social hierarchies based on age and apparent wisdom rather than just physical strength. They showed care for their elderly and their young. They worked cooperatively on complex tasks like maintaining the communal structures or organizing large foraging expeditions. They even seemed to have leisure activities. I observed what could only be called games played by the juveniles, with rules that everyone appeared to understand and follow. One individual caught my attention early on, a younger adult female with distinctive lighter patches in her dark brown fur. She seemed more curious than the others, more observant of her surroundings. Several times I noticed her looking in the direction of our observation posts, though I was certain she couldn't actually see us behind the camouflage glass. Still, something about her awareness made me wonder if she sensed a presence even if she couldn't identify what or where we were. After weeks of observation, I became somewhat obsessed with understanding the Bigfoot communication system. Every evening, back in my quarters, I'd review my notes and try to identify patterns. I started creating what amounted to a translation dictionary, though that term feels too formal for what was really just my best guesses at meaning. Low rumbles definitely seemed to indicate contentment or greeting. Sharp barks were warnings or alarm calls. But the body language and gestures were where the real complexity lay. Body posture appeared to be crucial to their communication. An upright stance with shoulders back and head held high seemed to convey assertion or authority. Hunched shoulders and a lowered head indicated submission or respect, similar to how wolves show deference to a pack leader. When Bigfoots wanted to appear non-threatening, they made themselves smaller, crouching down and avoiding direct eye contact. Hand gestures were equally important. Open palms facing outward clearly meant peaceful intentions. Closed fists were a sign of aggression or defensive readiness. A specific gesture where they touched their chest and then extended their hand seemed to be a form of greeting or acknowledgement. Eye contact followed strict rules that took me a while to figure out. Direct, prolonged staring was a challenge or threat, especially when combined with an upright posture. The Bigfoots used this behavior when asserting dominance or warning others away. Conversely, looking away or glancing sideways showed respect and non-aggression. When approaching elders or entering another's space, Bigfoots would consistently avert their eyes as a sign of deference. I started practicing these signals in private when I was alone in my quarters. I know it sounds ridiculous, but I'd stand in front of a mirror and practice the different postures and gestures, trying to get them exactly right. I attempted to mimic the low, rumbling sounds, though my human vocal cords couldn't produce anything close to their deep resonance. Still, I felt like I was learning to speak a new language, and some part of me knew this knowledge might someday be important. 6 weeks into the observation period, everything changed. It was late afternoon, and I was in the northern observation post when I heard shouting over the radio. A perimeter patrol had gotten too close to the forest edge while checking the fence line, and they'd startled a Bigfoot who'd been foraging nearby. The radio chatter was frantic. The soldiers sounded panicked. From my position on the ridge, I could see the situation unfolding below. A massive male Bigfoot, one of the largest I'd observed, had been gathering plants near the village perimeter when he'd encountered 3 armed soldiers maybe 50 yards away. The Bigfoot's initial reaction was defensive. He'd risen to his full height, probably close to 9 feet tall, and had let out a series of sharp warning barks. The soldiers had frozen, unsure what to do. But then the Bigfoot made a decision. He charged. I've never seen anything move that fast. Despite his enormous size, the Bigfoot covered ground with terrifying speed. The soldiers raised their weapons, shouting commands at each other and into their radios. The Bigfoot was now less than 30 yards away and closing. In a few more seconds, someone was going to get killed. Either the soldiers would fire or the Bigfoot would reach them. Without thinking, I grabbed my radio, yelled that I was intervening, and ran out of the observation post. I've never run so fast downhill in my life. I crashed through bushes and jumped over rocks, my only thought to get between the soldiers and the Bigfoot before shots were fired. I burst out of the tree line just as the Bigfoot was maybe 20 yards from the soldiers. I threw myself forward, positioning myself in the charging Bigfoot's path, and did something that felt insane but was the only thing I could think of. I dropped into a crouch, hunched my shoulders forward, looked down at the ground, and held my palms up and open toward the Bigfoot. Then I attempted to make a low, rumbling sound, though it came out more like a desperate groan. The Bigfoot stopped. Just stopped, maybe 10 feet away from me. He was breathing hard, his chest heaving, and I could smell him. A strong, musky odor mixed with pine and earth. For several seconds that felt like hours, he stared at me while I kept my eyes down and my posture submissive. Then I slowly began backing away, still crouched, still showing my palms. I made a gesture I'd seen the Bigfoots use to indicate moving back or retreating. Behind me, I could hear the soldiers arguing in urgent whispers about whether to shoot. I hissed at them to be quiet and to slowly back away. The Bigfoot watched us retreat. He didn't pursue, but he didn't relax either. He remained in that alert, upright stance, tracking our movement. I continued backing up, maintaining the submissive posture until we'd put maybe 50 yards between us and him. Only then did I risk standing fully upright and turning around. The soldiers looked at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. But it had worked. The Bigfoot turned and disappeared back into the forest, and no one had been hurt. Back at the command center, the military officers were furious that I'd broken protocol and put myself at risk. But they also had to acknowledge that my intervention had probably prevented either a dead Bigfoot or dead soldiers, maybe both. The confrontation forced everyone to recognize something important. These creatures understood the same kind of body language and gestures that I'd observed them using with each other. They weren't just animals. They could read intent, recognize peaceful signals, and choose to respond accordingly. After that incident, new rules were implemented. No armed personnel were allowed within sight of the Bigfoot village without me present as an intermediary. Following the military incident, I was given permission to attempt direct contact with the Bigfoots. The authorities realized that understanding these beings was going to require more than observation from a distance. For several days, I sat at the edge of the forest near areas where I'd observed Bigfoots foraging. I'd find a spot with good visibility, sit down on a fallen log or flat rock, and simply wait. I made sure to adopt a submissive posture, hunched shoulders, downcast eyes, open palms resting on my knees. I wanted any Bigfoot who saw me to understand immediately that I posed no threat. The first 2 days, nothing happened. I'd sit for hours, barely moving, while birds and small animals gradually accepted my presence and went about their business around me. Twice I saw Bigfoots in the distance, but they avoided my location. On the third day, though, something changed. It was mid-morning, and I'd been sitting in my usual spot for maybe 2 hours. I heard a soft rustling in the bushes to my left and resisted every urge to turn and look. Instead, I kept my head down and my posture non-threatening. Through the corner of my eye, I saw her emerge from the forest. It was the curious female Bigfoot I'd observed so many times from the observation post, the one with the lighter patches in her dark fur. She stopped about 30 feet away, partially hidden behind a large pine tree. I could feel her watching me, studying me. I didn't move, I barely breathed. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes, she took a few steps closer, moving with careful deliberation. Now she was maybe 25 feet away. Still, I didn't look up. I heard her sniff the air, sampling my scent. Then more footsteps, each one bringing her closer. When I judged she was maybe 15 feet away, I slowly reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out something I'd brought for exactly this possibility. A handful of dried fruit from the military rations. Moving as slowly as I possibly could, telegraphing every movement, I placed the fruit on the ground in front of me. Then I backed away several feet and resumed my submissive position, eyes down, palms open. The Bigfoot approached even more cautiously now. I could hear her breathing, hear the soft sounds of her feet on the forest floor. She stopped at the dried fruit, and I heard her pick it up. There was a pause, probably while she examined it, maybe smelled it. Then I heard chewing sounds. She was eating the offering. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure she could hear it. After finishing the fruit, she didn't leave immediately. I felt her presence nearby for several more minutes before I heard her retreat back into the forest. When I finally looked up, she was gone. It doesn't sound like much, but that brief interaction felt monumental. I'd offered something to a Bigfoot, and she'd accepted it. She'd chosen to approach me, to trust me enough to take food I provided. It was the first peaceful, voluntary contact between our species in recorded history, and I was shaking with the significance of it. After that first contact, I returned to the same spot every day. Each morning, I'd hike out to what I'd started thinking of as our meeting place and settle in to wait. Sometimes the female Bigfoot would appear within an hour. Other days it would take longer. A few times she didn't show up at all, but more often than not, she'd emerge from the forest and we'd repeat the ritual. I'd place an offering on the ground, fruit, nuts, sometimes interesting stones I'd found, and she'd approach to accept it. Gradually, the distance between us shrank. Where she'd initially stopped 20 or 30 feet away, after a week she was comfortable coming within 10 feet, then 5 feet. I remained motionless during these encounters, letting her set the pace and determine how close was comfortable. I noticed she'd started bringing things too. One day she left a piece of woven grass near where I sat. Another time it was a carved stick with simple geometric patterns etched into it. Then a collection of unusual seed pods. I understood these were gifts, her side of the exchange we were building. Our interactions became more complex as her comfort level increased. She'd sometimes make soft vocalizations, low rumbles that seemed questioning or curious. I'd respond with my poor imitation of the sounds, and I swear she seemed amused by my attempts. She started making gestures I'd observed in the village, and I'd mirror them back to her. Gradually, I began to understand the nuances better through this direct interaction. A slight variation in a hand gesture could change its meaning. The tone and duration of a rumble conveyed different emotions. After 2 weeks of daily meetings, something remarkable happened. I was sitting in my usual spot when she approached, but this time she didn't stop at her customary distance. She kept coming until she was standing directly in front of me, so close I could have reached out and touched her. My heart hammered in my chest, but I maintained my submissive posture. Then, slowly and gently, she reached down and touched my hand. Her fingers were enormous compared to mine and covered in coarse hair, but her touch was surprisingly gentle. She turned my hand over, examining my palm, running her fingers over my skin. I realized she was fascinated by how different we looked. Her thick fur and my bare skin, her massive hands, and my comparatively tiny ones. That moment of physical contact changed everything. The barrier between us had been crossed. From that day forward, our encounters felt less like careful negotiations and more like meetings between two beings who developed a genuine connection. Trust had been established, and it was mutual. The morning after that first physical contact, I arrived at our meeting place to find the female Bigfoot already waiting. That was unusual. Normally, I'd wait for her to appear. But what happened next was even more unexpected. Instead of our usual exchange, she made a specific gesture I'd observed in the village. A beckoning motion combined with a turn toward the forest. She wanted me to follow her. I glanced toward where I knew the nearest observation post was hidden, making a subtle hand signal to indicate what was happening. Then I stood up slowly, adopting the submissive posture that had become second nature, and followed the Bigfoot into the forest. She moved through the trees with ease, occasionally looking back to make sure I was keeping up. The path was rough, and I had to pick my way carefully over roots and around boulders, while she seemed to glide over obstacles without effort. As we got closer to the village, I started seeing other Bigfoots in the distance, watching from behind trees or from elevated positions on rocks. They made no move toward us, but their attention was intense and unnerving. I kept my shoulders hunched and my eyes down, trying to appear as non-threatening as possible. My guide led me right to the edge of the village clearing, then stopped. She made a series of gestures that I interpreted as telling me to wait. All activity in the village had ceased. Every Bigfoot was standing still, watching the edge of the clearing where I waited. The silence was profound and terrifying. Then, from the largest structure near the center of the village, a massive Bigfoot emerged. This was the silver-haired elder I'd observed leading the morning gatherings, the one who clearly held authority over the community. He had to be close to 10 feet tall, his shoulders incredibly broad, his presence commanding even from a distance. He approached slowly, deliberately, his eyes fixed on me. I sank lower into my submissive crouch, made myself as small as possible, kept my gaze firmly on the ground. When he reached me, he stopped maybe 3 feet away. I could feel him studying me, could hear his breathing. Then I felt his hand on my head, not rough, not threatening, but firm. He was examining me the same way the female had examined my hand, satisfying himself about what I was. After what felt like several minutes, but was probably less, he stepped back. I heard him make a series of vocalizations and gestures to the female Bigfoot who'd brought me. She responded with her own gestures and sounds. I had no idea what was being communicated, but it felt like she was vouching for me, explaining why she'd brought me here. The elder was silent for a long moment. Then he made a decisive gesture. A sweeping motion toward the village that seemed to indicate permission. The female touched my shoulder gently and gestured for me to follow. I was being allowed to enter their village. As I followed her into the clearing, maintaining my careful, respectful posture, Bigfoot slowly resumed their activities around us. But I could feel eyes on me everywhere. Children peeked out from behind adults. Elders watched intently from the entrances to their structures. This was unprecedented, and everyone knew it. I was the first human to walk through their village, and the weight of that responsibility was enormous. Over the following weeks, I spent hours each day in the Bigfoot village, always accompanied by the female who'd first befriended me. Gradually, I was able to observe their daily life, not from a distant observation post, but from within their community. What I witnessed was far more sophisticated and culturally rich than I'd imagined, even from my extensive external observations. Each morning began with the community gathering I'd observed so many times before, but now I could see the details up close. The elder didn't just make random vocalizations. He was conducting a kind of planning session. He'd gesture toward different directions, and certain adults would nod in acknowledgement. Others would make responding gestures that seemed to be offering suggestions or information. It was clear they were coordinating the day's foraging activities, sharing information about where food was plentiful, possibly discussing areas to avoid. When the gathering concluded, everyone knew what their responsibilities were for the day. The division of labor was even more sophisticated than I'd realized from a distance. Adults didn't just randomly forage, they had specific roles and expertise. Some were gatherers who specialized in knowing which plants were edible and when they were ripe. Others were tool makers who spent their days carefully shaping stones into implements. A few seemed to be builders who maintained the structures and made repairs. Juveniles were always learning, always practicing. I watched young Bigfoots attempting to weave baskets under the patient guidance of adults, making mistakes and trying again until they got it right. The tool use was remarkable. They'd created shaped stones specifically for grinding plant fibers and seeds. Woven baskets of different sizes served different purposes. Tight weaves for carrying water, looser weaves for gathering. Carved digging sticks had been hardened in fire and sharpened to precise points. Everything was purposeful, designed through trial and error and then passed down through teaching. Food preparation happened in a communal area where gathered plants were processed together. I watched Bigfoots working side by side, some grinding seeds into flour-like powder, others preparing roots by scraping off the outer layers, still others sorting through berries and fruits. There was coordination and cooperation, with individuals helping each other with difficult tasks. The elderly participated too, their experience valued even if their physical strength had diminished. Shelter maintenance was a regular activity. The structures were built from woven branches and reinforced with mud and plant fibers. They required constant repair, replacing worn sections, reinforcing weak points, reapplying mud that had eroded. Several Bigfoots would work together on a structure, some holding branches in place while others wove them together. Young ones would fetch materials, learning through participation. The social hierarchy was clear but not rigid. Elders made major decisions and their wisdom was respected, but it wasn't based on physical dominance. Adults deferred to elders naturally through gestures and body language. Juveniles learned from anyone older and more experienced, but I also saw what looked like debates. Bigfoots making competing gestures and vocalizations, discussing something before reaching agreement. They had social structure, but they also had discussion and even democracy of a sort. Family bonds were strong and obvious. Mothers stayed close to their young offspring, teaching them constantly. But I also saw what appeared to be extended family groups. Multiple adults sharing responsibility for juvenile care. Groups that stayed together and worked cooperatively. The elderly were cared for with patience and gentleness. I watched a young adult helping an elder gather food, slowing her pace to match his, assisting without taking over. In the evenings, as the sun set and the valley filled with shadows, the community would gather again around the central fire. This time felt different from the morning gathering, less about planning and more about connection. They'd sit together, making low vocalizations that rose and fell in what sounded almost like music. Sometimes one Bigfoot would vocalize while others listened. It reminded me of storytelling, though I had no way to know what stories they might be sharing. Juveniles would play nearby, chasing each other in games that seemed to have rules and objectives. The whole scene felt peaceful and deeply communal. The more time I spent with them, the more impossible it became to see them as anything other than people. Different from humans, yes, but people nonetheless, with culture and tradition, with families and communities, with wisdom passed down through generations. They weren't primitive animals surviving on instinct. They were a sophisticated society that had found a way to live in harmony with their environment, requiring no more than what the valley provided, leaving no lasting scars on the land. As my acceptance within the village grew, I began to notice aspects of their culture that went beyond basic survival. There was an area at the north end of the village that seemed to hold special significance. The trees there had been carved with intricate symbols and patterns. Woven objects that served no obvious practical purpose hung from branches. Decorative, ritualistic, or perhaps both. Stones had been arranged in deliberate patterns on the ground. I observed the community gathering at this special area once a week, always at the same time of day when the afternoon sun created particular light patterns through the trees. The gathering was formal and ritualistic. Bigfoots would arrange themselves in a specific pattern, with elders at the center and others in concentric circles around them. The elder leader would make elaborate gestures toward the sky, the sun, the surrounding mountains. Others would respond with their own gestures, all following what was clearly an established pattern or ceremony. I couldn't help but interpret this as spiritual or religious practice, some form of reverence for nature, or perhaps honoring ancestors, or both. The solemnity and repetition suggested these were important traditions that had been maintained across many generations. This wasn't simple animal behavior. This was philosophy, belief, meaning-making. One day, my guide brought me to an area just outside the village that I'd never visited before. There, partially hidden by vegetation, was what could only be described as a burial ground. Stones had been carefully arranged to mark individual graves, at least a dozen, possibly more that were too overgrown to identify clearly. The arrangements were deliberate and respectful. Some stones had simple carved marks, all faced in the same direction toward the rising sun. The female Bigfoot stood at the burial ground with obvious reverence. She touched certain stones gently, made specific gestures. This was sacred ground, and she was showing it to me because I'd earned enough trust to be allowed to witness it. The implications were profound. These beings buried their dead with ceremony. They maintained grave sites. They remembered those who'd passed. They had death rituals and, by extension, concepts of mortality and whatever might lie beyond. The evidence of long habitation in this valley was everywhere once I knew to look for it. The pathways between structures and to common areas weren't just worn from recent use. They were deeply grooved into the earth from decades or centuries of footsteps. Ancient fire pits showed layers of use extending deep into the ground. The ceremonial cave behind the village had walls covered in carvings that showed different styles, suggesting they'd been made over a very long time period by different individuals or generations. This hidden valley had provided the perfect refuge for this community. It had a reliable water source from the stream that ran year-round. The diverse forest provided abundant food throughout the seasons. The cliffs offered natural defense from predators and, crucially, concealment from the outside world. The Bigfoots hadn't randomly chosen this place. They'd found or been led to an ideal sanctuary, and they'd maintained it successfully for what might be hundreds of years. I realized with growing certainty that this wasn't a random group of creatures who happened to be in the same place. This was an established society with deep roots, with history and tradition, with a sophisticated understanding of their environment and how to live within it sustainably. They represented an alternative path of intelligent development, one that had remained separate from human civilization and had survived precisely because of that separation. 3 months into the operation, disaster nearly struck again. A helicopter making a supply run flew too close to the village, either because the pilot was new or because someone had miscalculated the safe distance. The sound of rotor blades echoing off the cliff walls was deafening even from my position in the observation post. Down in the village, the effect was immediate and terrifying. Bigfoot scattered in panic. The juveniles were screaming in fear, a sound I'd never heard from them before, high-pitched and desperate. Adults rushed to grab the young ones, trying to usher them into structures or toward the forest. But 3 large males, including the silver-haired elder, reacted differently. They grabbed weapons, heavy clubs and sharpened stakes that I'd seen them make but never use, and began moving deliberately toward the perimeter fence where military personnel were stationed. I saw the whole thing unfolding like a nightmare in slow motion. The soldiers at the fence line spotted the approaching Bigfoots and began shouting into radios. More soldiers appeared, forming a defensive line, weapons raised. The Bigfoots kept coming, moving with clear, hostile intent. They weren't fleeing in fear. They were advancing to eliminate a perceived threat to their community. I didn't even think. I just ran. Down from the observation post, through the forest, stumbling over roots and nearly falling a dozen times, I could hear shouting ahead. Soldiers yelling commands, the helicopter still thundering overhead, though it was banking away now. I burst out of the tree line and saw the 3 Bigfoots maybe 50 yards from the fence, still advancing. The soldiers had their rifles up, fingers on triggers. One wrong move from either side and multiple beings would die. I ran toward the Bigfoots, putting myself between them and the soldiers, waving my arms frantically and making every submissive gesture I knew. I was making sounds, desperate vocalizations that probably meant nothing but were the best I could do. The Bigfoots saw me but didn't stop immediately. They were focused on the threat ahead, driven by instinct to protect their community. I threw myself directly in front of the elder male, forcing him to either stop or run me over. He stopped. I was crouched low, shoulders hunched almost to the ground, making myself as small and non-threatening as possible. I made the gesture for peace, for stopping, for retreat. I tried to convey with every fiber of my being that the threat was gone, that the noise had stopped, that there was no danger to the village. The elder looked at me, then past me at the soldiers, then back down at me. The tension in those seconds was unbearable. He could easily have killed me with one swing of the massive club he carried. Behind him, the other 2 males were making aggressive vocalizations, ready to fight. The elder raised his hand. I thought he was going to strike, but instead he made a gesture to the other males. A command. They hesitated, clearly wanting to continue forward, but they obeyed. Slowly, they began backing away, keeping their eyes on the soldiers. I maintained my submissive posture, but also gestured urgently to the soldiers behind me to lower their weapons and back away. There was arguing, confused shouting, but eventually they complied. The Bigfoots continued their retreat toward the village, moving slowly and never turning their backs on the perceived threat. I stayed where I was between the 2 groups until the Bigfoots had disappeared back into the tree line. When I finally stood and turned around, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. The military commanders were furious at the helicopter pilot, at the situation, at me for putting myself at risk again. But they were also visibly shaken by how quickly the situation had escalated and how close they'd come to a violent confrontation. I emphasized to anyone who would listen that if shooting had started, humans would have died. These Bigfoots were far stronger than any human. They could tear a person apart with their bare hands. They'd shown remarkable restraint by not attacking, but we couldn't count on that restraint if we continued to threaten them. New protocols were immediately implemented. All aircraft had to maintain a minimum distance that wouldn't cause alarm in the village. No groups of armed personnel were allowed near the perimeter without specific authorization. And I was given authority to shut down any operation if I judged it was creating a dangerous situation. The military didn't like taking orders from a civilian, but they recognized that my ability to communicate with the Bigfoots was the only thing preventing a catastrophic incident. After the second crisis, something shifted in how the Bigfoots treated me. The elder male, who'd nearly attacked the soldiers, began showing me a level of trust and acceptance I hadn't experienced before. He would gesture for me to accompany him to different areas of the village, showing me things that had previously been off limits. It felt like he recognized that I'd put myself at risk to protect both sides, and that had earned me deeper access to their world. He brought me to the cave system behind the village that I'd only seen from a distance. The caves extended deep into the cliff face, and it became clear they served as winter quarters when the valley became too cold for the outdoor structures. The Bigfoots had modified the caves over time, smoothing the floors, creating natural shelves for storage, even carving ventilation channels to allow smoke from fires to escape. It was ingenious adaptation of natural shelter. In the deepest chambers, I saw their food storage system. They'd created climate-controlled areas by taking advantage of the cave's natural temperature regulation. Dried plants hung from the ceiling. Roots and tubers were buried in sand to preserve them. Nuts were stored in woven containers stacked carefully on stone shelves. They had enough preserved food to survive harsh winters when foraging would be impossible. This wasn't hand-to-mouth survival. This was planning and foresight. The elder showed me the tool-making area where Bigfoots crafted their implements. The process was methodical and skillful. They'd select specific types of stone for different purposes, then carefully chip away material to create the desired shape. Some tools were for cutting, others for grinding, still others for digging. Each was shaped precisely for its function. Watching them work, I realized their tool-making sophistication was comparable to human Paleolithic cultures. In another chamber, juveniles were being taught by adults. I watched as an elder demonstrated how to identify edible plants using smell, touch, and appearance. The young ones would examine samples, make their guesses, and the elder would confirm or correct them. Another adult was teaching basket weaving techniques, showing the proper way to split plant fibers and weave them into tight, functional patterns. Education was hands-on, patient, and clearly valued. Then the elder brought me to a chamber I can only describe as ceremonial. The walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, probably thousands, layer upon layer, spanning what must have been generations. Some were huge, from large adult males, others were tiny, from juveniles. They'd been made using different pigments: red, ochre, black charcoal, white clay. The effect was overwhelming, a visual record of every individual who'd been part of this community stretching back through time. Interspersed with the handprints were carved symbols and paintings similar to those I'd first seen in the Discovery Cave. The images showed Bigfoots in various activities: hunting, gathering, building, caring for young. Some depicted what looked like important events, possibly disasters like floods or fires that had affected the community. Others showed figures that might have been important leaders or elders. This was their history, preserved in the only way they had available. These weren't recent additions. The deeper carvings were worn smooth by time, some so old they were barely visible. The elder stood with me in that chamber for a long time, making gestures toward different sections of the wall. I couldn't understand everything he was trying to communicate, but the message was clear enough. He wanted me to understand the depth of their history, the antiquity of their culture. His people had been here for countless generations. They had a past, they had traditions, they had meaning that extended beyond mere survival. Through a series of gestures and expressions, the elder seemed to convey pride in his people, a sense of connection to ancestors who'd come before, and an understanding that this culture would continue after he was gone. Standing in that sacred space, surrounded by the physical evidence of generations of Bigfoot lives, I felt profound honor at being allowed to witness it. I was seeing something no other human had seen in recorded history, maybe ever. As my access to the Bigfoot community deepened, I began noticing increased tension with the military command. The commanders were becoming uncomfortable with how much time I spent in the village, how close my relationship with the Bigfoots had become. More troubling, I started overhearing conversations and seeing documents that suggested pressure from higher government authorities to contain the situation more strictly and limit my exposure. New restrictions were imposed. I had to wear a tracking device at all times so they knew exactly where I was. My visits to the village were limited to specific hours. Most concerningly, I was told I'd need armed escorts whenever I approached the Bigfoot territory. I argued vehemently against this last requirement. The Bigfoots had finally accepted me fully, and introducing armed soldiers into that equation would destroy the trust we'd built. After heated discussions, a compromise was reached. I could continue solo visits, but under increased surveillance from the observation posts. The atmosphere at the military outpost had changed. Where there had initially been curiosity and even excitement about what we were learning, now there was bureaucratic anxiety and control. Higher-ups who'd never seen the Bigfoots, who'd never witnessed their intelligence and culture, were making decisions about how to handle them. I heard rumors that plans were being developed to relocate the entire Bigfoot community to a controlled facility where they could be studied more systematically. The idea horrified me. These beings had lived in this valley for potentially centuries. This was their home, their sacred place. Relocating them would be catastrophic, not just physically traumatic, but spiritually and culturally devastating. It would destroy their connection to their ancestral lands, to the burial grounds where their dead rested, to the ceremonial sites where they practiced their traditions. Many might not survive such trauma, and those who did would be broken. I tried to communicate this to the authorities, tried to make them understand what they'd be destroying, but I could see it in their faces. They didn't view the Bigfoots the way I did. To me, these were people with culture and history who deserved respect and protection. To the government officials, they were either potential security threats that needed to be contained or research subjects that could advance scientific knowledge. The possibility of learning from them, of peaceful coexistence, didn't seem to factor into their calculations. My role had become increasingly difficult. I was supposed to be a bridge between the two worlds, but I felt more like a spy, gaining the Bigfoot's trust while knowing the authorities were planning to upend their entire existence. The ethical weight was crushing. I'd helped establish contact, and now that contact was going to be used against them. 2 days after that final visit, I was informed the operation was officially terminated. I was to pack my belongings and prepare for evacuation. There would be no more visits to the village, no more contact with the Bigfoots. When I asked what would happen to them, I received only vague assurances that they'd be protected. The evasiveness in those answers told me everything I needed to know. They weren't going to leave the Bigfoots in peace. Before I was allowed to leave the site, I underwent extensive debriefings. Government officials questioned me for hours, extracting every detail about the Bigfoot's behavior, their social structure, their capabilities, their vulnerabilities. They were gathering intelligence, and I hated that I was providing it. But I had no choice. Refusing to cooperate would have violated my non-disclosure agreements and landed me in prison. Additional non-disclosure agreements were placed in front of me. These were even more restrictive than the originals. Life imprisonment was mentioned as the consequence for any disclosure of what I'd witnessed. The message couldn't have been clearer. I was never to speak of this to anyone, ever, for any reason. What had happened in that valley would remain classified indefinitely, known only to the few dozen people who'd been directly involved in the operation. I was flown out of the valley and returned to my normal life, though nothing felt normal anymore. The valley remained sealed, with increased security measures that made it even more impenetrable. I never learned the fate of the Bigfoot community. Were they relocated? Were they left in place but under permanent containment? I had no way of knowing and no way to find out. The area had been erased from maps so completely that even trying to locate it would raise red flags. The years passed. I continued my archaeological career, but every discovery felt hollow compared to what I'd experienced in that hidden valley. I carried the wooden token everywhere, hidden in my pocket, the only tangible proof that it had all really happened. Sometimes I'd take it out when I was alone and run my fingers over the carved symbols, remembering the female Bigfoot who'd trusted me, the elder who'd shown me his people's history, the community that had accepted a human into their world. The mandatory silence was the hardest part. I wanted to tell people what I'd learned, that we're not alone on this planet, that intelligence and culture take many forms, that there are wonders hidden in remote places if only we'd look with open minds. But I couldn't say anything. To family, to friends, to colleagues, I had to pretend that summer in the Rockies had been just another routine excavation. The weight of the secret was crushing. Now I'm an old man, and my granddaughter is about to turn 18. She's intelligent, curious, and open-minded, qualities that remind me of myself at her age. I've decided that if I can't speak the truth, I can at least write it down for someone I trust to understand its significance. This document is for her, to be given on her birthday with instructions to keep it safe and to believe in the impossible. I've written down everything: the discovery, the village, the Bigfoot's culture, my relationship with them, the military involvement, all of it. She deserves to know that the world is more mysterious and wonderful than most people realize. She deserves to know that there are other forms of intelligence on this planet, other ways of living that don't require cities and technology and constant expansion. She deserves to understand that we're not alone, that we never have been. What I experienced in that valley changed my understanding of humanity's place in the world. We assume we're the apex species, the pinnacle of evolution, the only truly intelligent beings on Earth. But the Bigfoot showed me a different kind of intelligence, one that's intuitive, connected to nature, sustainable over centuries, without depleting resources or destroying ecosystems. They've survived by remaining hidden, by taking only what they need, by living in harmony with their environment rather than trying to dominate it. Their culture is older than recorded human history in North America. While humans were building civilizations elsewhere, the Bigfoots were maintaining their traditions in hidden valleys, passing down knowledge through generations, honoring their dead, teaching their young. They represent an alternative path, a road not taken by human evolution, and they've survived precisely because they stayed separate from our increasingly destructive civilization. I wonder often about other hidden communities that might exist in remote corners of the world. If one group of Bigfoot survived in the Rockies, might there be others elsewhere? In other mountain ranges, in deep forests, in places humans rarely venture? The world is larger and wilder than our maps suggest, and there's still room for mystery if we're willing to acknowledge it. My great regret is that I couldn't protect them from government interference. I'd hoped that by facilitating peaceful contact, by demonstrating that the Bigfoots were intelligent beings worthy of respect, I could ensure they'd be left alone. Instead, my involvement gave the authorities access to them. I helped them study beings who should have remained unstudied, whose greatest protection was their obscurity. That guilt haunts me. But I also take pride in what we achieved, the Bigfoots and I together. We proved that peaceful coexistence between species is possible. We showed that communication doesn't require words, that trust can be built across vast biological and cultural differences. For a brief time, two very different forms of intelligent life connected and understood each other. That has to mean something. I believe the authorities were wrong to hide this discovery. The world needs to know we're not alone. We need to understand that intelligence and culture aren't uniquely human traits. We need the humility that comes from recognizing we share this planet with others who think and feel and create meaning in their own ways. But those in power fear the chaos such a revelation might cause, so they keep the truth locked away. Maybe someday the truth will come out. Maybe in my granddaughter's lifetime or her children's lifetime, the sealed valley will be opened, and the Bigfoot community's existence will be acknowledged. I hope by then that humanity has learned enough wisdom to treat them with the respect they deserve, to protect their way of life rather than trying to study or exploit them. The Bigfoots taught me that there's more than one way to be intelligent, more than one way to live, more than one path for conscious beings to take through their time on Earth. They showed me that civilization doesn't require cities, that culture doesn't require writing, that wisdom can be passed down through gesture and ceremony as effectively as through books. Most importantly, they taught me respect for forms of life that are different from our own. The human impulse is to study, to categorize, to control. But sometimes the wisest response to encountering something precious and rare is simply to let it be, to appreciate it without trying to capture or understand every detail, to protect it by leaving it alone. I hope the Bigfoot community still exists somewhere in those mountains, free and undisturbed despite everything. I hope they're still gathering each morning to plan their day, still teaching their young, still honoring their ancestors, still maintaining traditions that stretch back through more generations than we can count. I hope future generations of Bigfoots will grow up in that hidden valley, never knowing that for a brief time a human walked among them and learned to see the world through their eyes. To my granddaughter, seek truth wherever it might lead. Question the official stories when they don't ring true. Believe in possibilities that others dismiss. Stay open to wonder. And remember that the greatest discoveries often happen not when we try to force nature to reveal its secrets, but when we approach it with humility, patience, and respect. There's so much more to this world than we're told. I've seen it, I've lived it, and now you know it too. The carved wooden token sits on my desk as I finish writing this, a reminder of friends in the forest who changed everything I thought I knew. They're out there, or they were, and their existence means the world is more magical, more mysterious, and more wonderful than most people dare to imagine. Never stop believing in that magic because it's real. I promise you, it's real. For more interesting stories, check this out.